𝗲𝗷𝗿.
Howdy, and welcome back to Film And. I'm coming to you from a very snowy Burlington, Vermont, here in late April. Yes, it's snowing out. As any good Vermonter might know, winter is not over until you hit June. So here we are. There's 2 inches of snow on the ground. It will be gone by tomorrow, and we're basically in third winter at this point. But I'm coming to you from snowy Burlington, Vermont, with another segment of Deep Picks, where I basically pick a genre or topic and dive into some more deeper, unobvious picks of the genre. And this week, we are covering Metacinema, and this is in close reference to the film screenings class I have been attending this final spring semester of college, the topic of which is Metacinema. So I thought I would pick 3 of the films we watched in screenings this semester and talk about them for a bit. Now, this may be a contentious episode of Deep Picks because I bet you that almost all of you will have heard about all 3 of these films, or at least 1 or 2 of them. But the reasons that they feel like a deep pick to me is because I think each film in its own way has an almost subversive level of meta-commentary or metaphysical traits, because I think they are each overshadowed by another clear theme or motif that the film employs. So, a brief description and history of metacinema. Metacinema is a mode of filmmaking in which the film informs the audience that they are watching a work of fiction. I mean, it often references its own production and works against narrative conventions that aim to maintain the audience's suspension of disbelief. It's a movie that draws attention to the fact that you are watching a movie. Some of the most revered metacinema directors, in my opinion, are the ones that call attention to the form in a way to kind of pay homage to it and respect the art of filmmaking. And I think all 3 picks this episode kind of reflect that. And I would say the most famous first example of this is probably the classic Russian film Man with a Movie Camera in 1929, right at the dawn of the sound era. And the idea of metacinema comes back in many of the mid-century New Wave movements of Italy and France as well. I mean, you have like Fellini's 8.5, Ingmar Bergman's Persona, or Agnes Varda's Cleo from 5 to 7, which, if my tier list last season wasn't enough, please go find Cleo and watch it. The 70s brings a lot of iconic comedy films moving forward into the metacinema genre with Blazing Saddles and Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and even Airplane. And the 80s kind of does the same with, I'd say, more blockbuster appeal, having films like Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Spaceballs being pretty big successes. And then to close out the 20th century, the 90s in some ways feels like the most critically acclaimed decade of metacinema. Films like Living in Oblivion, Total Recall, Being John Malkovich, Abbas Kiarostami's Close Up, Wes Craven's Scream, and Fight Club, all being films that are praised to this day or at least have garnered cult following. And our past 20 years in metacinema have included the follow-up movies from directors who found success in the 90s, like David Lynch with Mulholland Drive and Charlie Kaufman with Adaptation and Schenectady, New York. And obviously, look at the last 10 years. You have some more recent highlights like Birdman, The Big Short, and Deadpool. And also, I can safely say that at this point in the semester with my screenings class, we have seen most of the films that I just referenced. We've been going chronologically, kind of starting in the mid-50s, where the first kind of boon of metacinema comes out in the mainstream, and up until now, I think we've hit about 2003. And we've especially watched a lot of the meta classics of the 90s. So overall, there was a long-standing tradition with metacinema, and some films that have found the most success employing this, in my opinion, aren't any ones with these overt examples, but movies that have almost a hidden aesthetic that allows the audience to acknowledge the meta without even realizing it. Subconscious metacinema, in a sense. To be perfectly honest, I think the only reason I kind of stood back and thought, hey, these are super meta, but not in an obvious sense, was because I watched them in a class designed to screen meta films, and my professor shined a light on them. So a quick shout out to my professor, Professor Tufte, in my screenings class. Thanks for bringing these to the forefront this semester. But all right, let's get into film number 1. Alfred Hitchcock's 1954 classic, Rear Window. This pick comes from someone who is not a big fan of Hitchcock in general, and for me, I gotta say this is easily one of his best. I mean, it's up there for me with like North by Northwest, and that is despite Hitchcock literally inserting himself onto the faces of Mount Rushmore in the poster. And if you haven't really looked at the poster to North by Northwest, please look again. Hitchcock's face is superimposed next to Lincoln's on Mount Rushmore, which, wow, the ego on that man, but that's neither here nor there. The plot summary of Rear Window is as follows. A wheelchair-bound photographer spies on his neighbors from his Greenwich Village courtyard apartment window in New York City and becomes convinced one of them has committed murder, despite the skepticism of his fashion model girlfriend. And the couple in question are portrayed by Jimmy Stewart and Grace Kelly in probably both of their most iconic roles. I mean, I will always say that Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is Stewart's best. It's my favorite, at least. And Grace Kelly also has Dial M for Murder, which is also quite amazing. But overall, the fact that the two of them are together here kind of makes their on-screen chemistry one of the reasons it works so well. So, when it comes to the meta element of this film, Jimmy Stewart's character is placed and framed in his apartment, which looks out on his adjacent apartment building neighbors. He is stuck in his wheelchair, watching the events of the film unfold, much how we, the audience, are in the seats in a theater watching the film. I mean, in many ways, it is a movie about watching life unfold like a movie. The set is constructed to look relatably like an apartment building in the big city, but just as much like a film set on some production studio lot. I mean, each apartment's window and intricate set design within the view of Jimmy Stewart is meticulously laid out, like a movie for him to watch. I mean, he is the audience as much as we are, making comments we might make if we were to watch this go on outside our own windows. And it kind of comes to this point where you realize, like, it kind of feels like an audience member is the protagonist, the one making the decisions, because he is the driving force of this film. Our relationship with the film is, with this, like, immediately brought to a new form of relatability. I mean, Jimmy Stewart is not a movie character on the film screen anymore. Hitchcock places him right next to us, and now it is a fellow audience member experiencing the events of the film, and in this way, I think we experience them for ourselves. I mean, this is where Hitchcock is able to then play with suspense so well, and it may be the most impressive aspect of the film. I mean, when Jimmy Stewart is in trouble, so are we. When his life is threatened, or he is hurting or concerned, we can share that same fear and tension thanks to Rear Window's visual and spatial relationship to the audience. Now, the question, why is this subversive metacinema? I honestly think the suspense element of the film, which Hitchcock was very familiar with successfully crafting at this point in his career. Just look at The Man Who Knew Too Much, 39 Steps, Rope, and Dial M for Murder. It becomes such an established aesthetic of Hitchcock films. It's hard to remember that this, above the rest, is very obvious with playing into audience expectation and perception. Many meta films have a movie within a movie scene or storyline, but Rear Window just subtly bakes that into the pie of the movie. It is rarely through overt exposition or plot points that the meta side comes out. It's contained mostly in the manner of filmmaking itself. The set design and multi-level placement that feels like a play, the camera movement that only rarely breaks the 180 line of the view outside Stewart's window, and maybe the best trait, the main character is a photographer. And for audiences in 1954, anyone watching in their 40s and 50s remembers, at least vaguely, a time of film being the fresh new evolution from still photography, developed only decades earlier. A great wordy explanation of this comes from 𝗖𝗵𝘁ci's appetite and temporality in Rear Window, another aspect of voyeurism. And this is the following quote, kind of expanding upon the point I just made. As mentioned above, the film as a meta-commentary on film and the cinematic apparatus relies on the depiction of Stewart, as Hitchcock, in his orchestration and narration of the images of the neighbors, and through his aesthetic manipulation of them through light, angle, and framing, photography. Stanley and Pearson austerely mention, this is a different article that's getting mentioned here. The sequence of slides that Jeff projects calls attention to the static photograph as the primordial point of departure for cinematic illusion. The photograph, the still photo, they argue, is the primordial point of departure, in that the 19th century saw the evolution of the photograph into motion pictures by way of serial photography. I would argue, in addition, that the static photograph, the product of Jeff's art, is the premier sign of the impulse for the fantasy of object fixity that the gaze promises. Before we as the audience are introduced to Lisa, Grace Kelly's character, we see her static image, first in the ghoulish negative, and then the positive print. Thus, Jeff trades in static images and exhibits a comfort in images that are either static or remote, seen through binoculars or a telephoto lens, a comfort he does not feel with people, particularly women, up close. Now, what is all that saying? It's basically the idea that Hitchcock is kind of playing with the history of film, the development of film itself, and that having Jeff be a photographer immediately points to the idea that he has this fantasy, this impulse, as McKittrick puts it, to photograph from a distance, to see things far away. It's not just that he broke his leg and he's in his apartment and he looks out his window. He's not just there. He's a photographer. He sees all this through his camera, just like in the same way we are seeing it through Hitchcock's camera. It's a very weird hat on a hat moment, but it's pretty damn impressive when you look at the context of this movie. So Hitchcock puts this meta themes not only in his setting, but his characters and their backstories as well. So I gotta say, don't let the somewhat straightforward suspense murder plot deceive you. This may be Hitchcock's meta masterpiece, just looking at this, because that is one slice of what Rear Window kind of has to offer from scene to scene. So yeah, good meta film. And he's Hitchcock. He's not the only director who has found great success in playing with meta cinema, because the next director we will be discussing is possibly even more well-known than Hitchcock for reminding the audience of the cinematic experience. So we're going to take a quick PSA break and be back with our second film of the deep picks of meta cinema.
All right, everybody in the car, let's go.
What are we gonna do first when we get there, Mom? Go for a hike?
Sure.
What about canoeing? Can we go canoeing too?
I don't see why.
How long does it take to get to the forest?
It's not that far, sweetie.
Are we there yet?
Yep, we're here.
Already?
It's a short drive from your neighborhood to your naturehood. Visit discovertheforest.org to find a neighborhood park or green space near you. Brought to you by the Ad Council and the U.S. Forest Service.
I'm jumping in with my clothes on.
Most party fouls are pretty dumb, but if you decide to drink and drive underage, you could lose your license and your freedom. Learn more at ultimatepartyfoul.org. Brought to you by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the Ad Council.
Running late to class but still need that morning caffeine or hot breakfast to start your day out right? Download the Bite app by Sodexo and place your custom order for fast, easy pickup at Zyme. Open 8:30 a.m. to 3 o'clock p.m. Mondays through Fridays.
Okay, welcome back. We are doing deep picks in the genre of meta cinema, and next up is a classic 70s film from none other than Stanley Kubrick and 1971's A Clockwork Orange. Now, fans of the film and verse may know that the pilot episode to Connor's new podcast, To Watch to Read, covered this next film. However, I feel it is my sad duty to inform you that To Watch to Read has been placed on indefinite hiatus after only one season and one lost episode. And I can understand that. Connor and Erica explained that they have been quite busy, and returning to the show consistently isn't viable right now considering the time and money that ends up needing to go into creating the show. So, To Watch to Read, you will be sorely missed. I want to say that. I have really enjoyed listening to this first season. And I guess in response to Erica's question at the end of episode 2 of To Watch to Read, and wow, Erica, you do throw Connor under the bus there, I did not come up with all the ideas for Filmand. I bring the editing, and Connor brings the dashing good looks and charisma, and that is the honest truth. Now, moving on. In the final 35 years of Kubrick's career, essentially his second wave, Clockwork stands as the quickest release after a previous film, coming only 3 years after 1968's 2001: A Space Odyssey. After this point, we get Barry Lyndon 4 years later, The Shining 5 years later, Full Metal Jacket 7 years later, and his final film, Eyes Wide Shut, 12 years later. So what is to be said about what honestly feels like one of Kubrick's most intimate and small-scale films, both locationally and kind of thematically? A Clockwork Orange follows Alex, portrayed by Malcolm McDowell, maybe his most iconic role, as a charismatic antisocial delinquent whose interests include classical music and ultra-violence, while he leads a small gang of thugs called the Droogs. The film chronicles the horrific crime spree of his gang, Alex's capture, and rehabilitation via an experimental psychological conditioning technique. Alex narrates most of the film in Nadsat, a fractured adolescent slang composed of Slavic languages, English, and a Cockney rhyming slang. So the first meta trait of Stanley Kubrick's Clockwork Orange that sticks out in the film has got to be this: the narration. There's this angular and dissociative storytelling that exists over the entire film, and Malcolm McDowell's Alex immediately plays with the relationship of the audience. In narration, I gotta say we are used to words that are essential to our understanding to a narrative. An introduction or an inner monologue that gives us further insight to a world we are expecting to be welcomed into. But with Clockwork, that is not the case. The narration is spoken in a broken future English that takes a while to grow accustomed to and sometimes only becomes clear with visual context clues. The narration is oftentimes contradictory to what the audience might think is correct or truthful, and all this is filtered through the sadistic and playfully cynical perspective of Alex. It makes us question in many ways how narration can or should be used in a cinematic context as we're actively experiencing the film. There are also numerous points of fourth wall breaks, like the opening shot of Malcolm McDowell staring down the camera in the milk ball. The vinyl soundtrack for Kubrick's previous film 2001 can be seen in the record store scene, and the constant allusions to real historical people in this sci-fi futurist film. The most notable of which is probably Ludwig van Beethoven, an individual often contextually placed in a much older art form, the classical music of 16th century Europe. And this might be something that would make much more sense in a film like Barry Lyndon, but here Kubrick takes an individual we all know well to be a historical figure of Baroque music and redefines our relationship with him, as Malcolm McDowell goes through various phases of relating to Beethoven's music. The use of Beethoven's Ninth makes us consider so obviously how the film itself is making us reconsider the historical figure we know and how he's almost become a new character within A Clockwork Orange. And then there is also Kubrick's cinematography work. I mean, so many times the camera movement seems to follow the protagonist as if we are like right there with him. Shots that come to mind are probably the POV of the writer on the ground during the Droogs' initial attack, kind of in the first half of the movie, and then the intense handheld shot of Alex approaching the writer's house in the rain later on. There was also a sequence of Malcolm speeding through the England countryside at night, and then the reverse, Alex's POV of speeding through the checkpoints in quiet hamlet roads, sending motorists just careening off the road. And this at all times works to play into the idea that we are peering into the actions of Alex's life, almost documentary style, but also being treated to perspective of those afflicted by him, the writer and his fellow Droogs, and similarly the viewpoint of the afflictor, Alex. This playing of like POV shots is probably one of the most obvious visual meta traits I say this film has, because there's also these very static, unmoving, tracking, documentary-like shots, but at many times it's the POV, it's people staring you right in the camera as if you're in a character that kind of reminds you and shakes you out of the narrative to say, you're in this too, you are in this movie, the audience is a character. So Kubrick, one of the most iconic meta-cinema directors of the second half of the 20th century, why is Clockwork a deep pick? Well, I can't help but consider this film, as is with most Kubrick films, in the modern context of its iconic status. Consider the footprint Clockwork Orange has left. It seems that above all things, the one trait that seems to have the most staying power in the public eye of Clockwork is the movie being a work of speculative fiction and a commentary on 70s culture in Britain. It feels like at times like an ugly, parodical take on how the stuffy elders of England imagine the future will be if the drugged-out hippies with their long hair and rock music grow up in a culture that allows their shenanigans. Kubrick is a pretty powerful criticizer with his films at times, and here it seems he's going against his own generation to show that the reality they think these youths in rebellion will bring about is absolutely ridiculous, and nothing more than just that, speculative fiction. So this is definitely the lasting impact in Clockwork, in my opinion, and it comes along with the iconic images. Malcolm McDowell with his painted eyelashes and the crazy costume, the set design, that one shot in the milk ball, him with his eyes peeled back, staring this footage in the movie theater. I mean, all these things, like, that's what you think of when you think of Clockwork. And sometimes the narrative and the experience kind of gets lost within that. And, despite other films of his, this seems like an equally powerful example of metacinema that may not be as obvious on a surface-level watch. Again, I had the gift of a college screening class to open my eyes wide shut to that iconic image of Alex in Clockwork and understand why this film is so meta. So, moving on, we've now covered two of the most film bro-y directors of all time, especially in the 20th century. So let's just go for the hat trick. Next up, Bob Fosse's All That Jazz. Film bros loving Bob Fosse. Because in the words of Connor, or maybe Steve, I forget, maybe either has said it, but I don't know. No one makes a film like Bob Fosse. And that, boy, ain't that the truth. Bob Fosse's 1979 film, All That Jazz, is another film that makes for a very dense piece of self-referential meta-cinema. And the film itself feels like a train of thought, or maybe a personal film of, again, speculative fiction, but in the present time. The film is meta-commentary on Bob Fosse writing a musical film about his life, and he himself is a man who choreographs musicals. The film also covers the trials and tribulations of the weight that Bob Fosse's position holds just in the public eye. Fosse writes the protagonist as himself, a film director and choreographer, which makes the audience confused to think whether this is meant to be an embellished, reenacted documentary or creative cinematic take on the past years of the writer-director's life. I mean, if there are questions that you're asking during this film, it's these. How real are the characters' maladies, relationships, and shortcomings? How much is Fosse living in his own neurotic head, or more in the public perception? How are we to take his life as it's presented to us? This contextually makes the film a unique one for Bob Fosse when defining the relationship of his audience. Because All That Jazz overall feels like this expression of unbridled creativity, like an observance, speculation, and creative visualization of his own life. And scenes contained within feel almost like a live riff on these themes, almost like jazz. And the further into the film you all, the more attention is called to the fact that you, the viewer, are watching a film, and Fosse incessantly pokes fun at that, and himself. A small quote from Andrew Horton's anthology book, Comedy Cinema Theory, got me thinking, and he has a chapter from Stephen Mamber entitled In Search of Radical Meta-Cinema. The critique from within and testing of audiences make up self-referential films' unlikely but prevalent radical meta-cinema. So, to break that quote down a little bit, the quote comes also in conversation with other self-referential films, like Kubrick's other works, Barry Lyndon and The Shining, as well as Scorsese's The King of Comedy. All That Jazz feels so self-referential and just overall community, society referential. whether it's referencing the world it lives in or its own ridiculousness. It seems the ones who will appreciate the film are most the ones who are in the know of Bob Fosse's real life, real persona. Member also mentions a different film, Scorsese's After Hours, which he kind of describes has just a moment of this deep referential meta. Perhaps the most obscure disparate linkage ever in a popular movie comes in Scorsese's After Hours. So weird, it's worth explaining. The possible robbers played by Cheech and Chong have finally gotten their hands on the wrapped sculpture they've been after throughout the movie. As they load it onto their truck, one of them remarks that he saw the sculptor play banjo on The Tonight Show. To get that joke and the parodic reference, one has to recognize that 1, the sculpture in question is in the style of artist George Segal, and number 2, the actor George Segal, spelled exactly the same way, had often appeared on talk shows playing the banjo badly. If you're up on early 80s pop trash and your New York City high alt scene, you might manage to keep up with Scorsese's joke. So to go back to that quote, this critique from within, the film literally critiquing itself and kind of playing around with the character and what he is seeing, what he's feeling, and the testing of audiences at the same time, showing these kind of magical, crazy potentialities of what Bob Fosse sees, make up an unlikely but prevalent radical metacinema. And all that jazz seems riddled with these very intricacies that may get lost on the casual viewer, even some that get by me, but the biggest fan and greatest scholar are able to decipher the subtext and meta-commentary of Fosse's work here. This exact reason is probably why I feel that all that jazz might get lost in the greater meta-cinema talk. Because despite its almost gatekeepery level of insider references throughout, at the end of the day, this thing is a musical. A magically choreographed, self-important, ecstatic, bursting musical. So in some ways, all that jazz gets wrapped up in Fosse's stage play reputation of musicals like Pajama Game, Damn Yankees, How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, Sweet Charity, Pippin, and Chicago, not to mention his other big cinema effort, Cabaret. So it's almost easy to look at this as one entry of Fosse's various credits and musicals, but this exists as such a deeply autobiographic and meta piece of cinema. I don't think it should be soon forgotten. It's also fun as hell. Holy crap, what a good time. Go watch this movie. It's insane. Like you're literally, your head is like doing flips trying to understand where the narrative is going. It really does keep you guessing. But yeah, that's it. Those are my 3 deep picks of meta cinema. And again, when it comes to deep picks, this might be my most shallow episode. We're not really hanging out in the deep end this week, you know? I really wanted to just bring to light that I think there's some movies out there that we perceive in a different light compared to either how they were perceived upon initial watch when they were released, whenever they were released, and also what the intention of the filmmaker might have been, the deeper themes that kind of get lost in the grand remembrance of these films. So, as always, these 3 films will be on my Filmman Letterboxd list, as well as right on my Letterboxd account, DA_N. And if you want to see any of the films we talked about in the first full seasons of Filmman, you can go to Connor's Letterboxd for his Filmman list at Cranberry18. That is C-R-A-N-D Berry 18. We've got another great episode coming up next week. It will be a recently released movie, one that just came out in the past month, that we will be discussing. So tune in for that. Thank you as always for tuning in, whether you're here on the radio waves or you're listening to the YouTube version. Thanks for listening. Hopefully by next week it'll be warm and sunny and all this snow will be gone and I can maybe crack a window when I'm recording one of these and enjoy the warm spring air. But until then, have a lovely rest of your week and you will hear from me soon. See ya.